Fabulous. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. This is our second postdoc hiring panel. So if you were with us, gosh, maybe 2-ish weeks ago, we did a hiring panel focused on academics, getting a job in academia. And we promised you that we would do another one on agency hiring, focusing on federal. And so we are doing that today. Just to let you know, there are 28 attendees. Super range of postdocs across the college. Thank you all for joining. Just some technical / logistic bits. You all should be able to see a Q&A icon. So if you have questions for the panelists, please put them in the Q&A. All the panelists can see that, and panelists can choose to answer those privately back to you, answer those to the group, do that verbally the way I'm speaking to you now, and or type something into the Q&A. So panelists, you should look and see you've got a Q&A icon along the gutter bottom of your screen. Everybody also has a chat icon, that little thought bubble icon. And what we'd like to do is reserve the chat for technical difficulties. For instance, if all the postdocs are just watching my mouth move, and you can't see anything, please type that here. Right. Okay. So we're gonna chat is technical difficulties, and Q&A is for interaction with the panelists. Okay. So let me. We also have one panelist with technical difficulties, and we're trying to figure that out. So I'll introduce our other panelists. I realize that everybody's Zoom may be different. So hi, I'm in the center. I'm Julia Parrish. I'm the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs in the College of the Environment. Okay. So let's see, on this side of me, I have Michelle McClure, who's the director of the Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory, which is part of NOAA. I'm just gonna tell you who these folks are, and then I'm going to ask each of them to give a little bit longer self-introduction, including a little bit about what is this place that you're a part of, so the postdocs can get a sense of what does your space of federal agency land look like? Okay, so on this side of me is Sarah Converse, who you saw last time in the academic job hiring, because she is a faculty member, but she is also simultaneously the unit leader for the Washington Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit, which is part of the conglomerate of cooperative research units, which is part of USGS. Or US Geological Survey. Okay, let's see. Down here for me is Kevin Werner, who's the director of the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, which is also part of NOAA. And directly below me is Simon Kihia, who is the research program manager, or a research program manager, at the Pacific Northwest Research Station, which is part of US Forest Service. So a whole nother agency, not under Interior. Okay, and then we hope joining us, if we can figure out the technical difficulties, is Jill Rolland, who's the director of the Western Fisheries Research Center, which is also part of USGS. So a really fantastically broad array of folks who are in leadership positions across a range of our federal agencies, certainly that we partner with in the college and at the University of Washington, and who all run just amazing, amazing research centers, and can speak to us just for a few minutes each about a sort of overview. I'm asking you all to talk about what your part of the federal agency house does. And from there, we'll get a little more into postdocs being hired into research positions in your shops. So Michelle, why don't we start with you?
Hey, thanks. As Julia said, my name is Michelle McClure. I'm the director of the Pacific Marine Environmental Lab. NOAA is made up of several sub-agencies that are kind of stapled together. We are part of the Oceanic and Atmospheric Research arm of NOAA. And we are one of 3 wet labs that NOAA Research has. We have one in Miami, one here in Seattle, and one in the Great Lakes. Our focus overall is, we actually cover a big span of things. We do a lot of climate work, looking at global heat and carbon budgets. We do seasonal forecasts, things like ENSO research. We have a fair bit of work on sort of Earth systems, ocean-Earth system interactions. We have tsunami modeling. We look at hydrothermal vents and methane seeps and their contributions to the overall oceanic nutrient cycling, methane budgets, so on and so forth. We have a large fisheries and oceanography group that works closely to sort of link everything from physics and chemistry all the way up to fish sticks. A large ocean acidification group, and a pretty big presence in the Arctic in general, looking at both atmospheric dynamics and sea ice overall. My path here was a little circuitous. This is, depending on how you count it, my 4th career. I actually started, I'm a Washington native. I grew up in Paulsbo. I went to the Evergreen State College, had a variety of adventures before grad school. I went to Cornell. Ended up at NOAA Fisheries at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, worked on both salmon conservation and then on groundfish harvest management. And I'm actually quite new to this position, so it's been a really fun year learning the science and getting to know a new part of NOAA.
Thanks, Michelle. Sarah, how about you?
Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Converse. I know a lot of you. So as Julia said, I work for the Cooperative Research Units, which is part of the ecosystem mission area within USGS. We're a national program. We're in 40 different universities throughout the US. And our mission is to work with state and federal agencies to connect them to university resources for research. So I work closely with a lot of state and federal agencies, and also to train the next generation of leaders in fish and wildlife science and management. So the Cooperative Research Units program is about 90 years old. We've had lots of different homes. Our current home is in USGS. Before I was here in this position with CRU, I spent 10 years at a USGS Science Center. So the USGS Science Centers inside the ecosystems mission area, I think there are 18 of them. One of them is the Western Fisheries Research Center, where Jill Rolland is here at in Seattle. I worked for a research center outside of Washington, D.C. for 10 years. And basically the way I got here, I did a postdoc in the research center, Patuxent Wildlife Research Center outside of DC. And then that led to a permanent job. And I was there for, 10 years. And then I've been here about 3. So my experiences are primarily in providing research in support of other agencies, federal agencies, state agencies. And so because of that, I end up touching and interacting with people in a lot of different kinds of agencies. All of the bureaus within Department of Interior, as well as state agencies, and NOAA and some other agencies. And maybe at some point, Julia, we can sort of give like the big picture overview of what are the federal agencies that our postdocs might be looking at.
Yeah, that would be great. But before we do that, Jill, can you hear us? And it looks like you are intrepid and have joined us by a phone. Is that true?
That is correct. I hope you can hear me.
Excellent, everybody. I'm introducing you to a phone, which is actually a person, Jill Rolland, the director of the Western Fisheries Research Center of USGS. And Jill, why don't you just leap in and give yourself a longer introduction, including your part of the federal house, just a little bit about it, before we leap into more detailed questions.
Okay, thank you, and I apologize. I think I'm having network bandwidth issues. So thanks to Sarah for giving a little introduction to the U.S. Geological Survey, which is divided into 7 mission areas, and I think most folks are probably most familiar with the work we do in geology, geography, natural hazards, those areas. And I won't go into the history, but suffice to say that the ecosystem science centers, of which there are now 16, there's been some consolidation. We originally came from various parts of the Department of Interior and are considered the research arm to support other parts of Interior like Fish and Wildlife Service, Park Service, Bureau of Reclamation. We're to provide the science to those agencies that have more of a regulatory type of role. So our lab, Western Fisheries, is in Magnuson Park off of 65th Street. It's been there mostly in that location in some shape or form since the 1930s. We have a large division that works, specializes in fish diseases, aquatic animal health. So we have the Seattle location. We also have a laboratory at Marrowstone Point, which is right by Fort Flagler. And then I have 2 kind of large, more field-oriented field stations, one on the Columbia River in Cook, Washington, sort of across the river from Hood River and up in the hills, and another field station in Klamath Falls, Oregon. So my background, quickly, I did my undergraduate at the University of Washington. I grew up primarily in Mukilteo, Washington. I spent 7 years in Norway, where I did my master's and PhD in fish health, microbiology, University of Bergen in Norway. Came back, worked 10 years for the U.S. Department of Agriculture Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service doing regulatory animal health, and that was in the D.C. area. And I've been at Western Fisheries since 2012. So that's my path in a nutshell.
Great. Thanks so much, Jill. Simon, love to turn to you and the Forest Service.
Just unmuting myself.
Yep, we hear you. Thanks.
Okay. My name is Simon Kihia. I work for the Pacific Northwest Research Station, which is headquartered in Portland and covers the 3 states, Oregon, Washington, and Alaska. I am a research program manager. We are 5 of us, each one of us covering a major area of research. Mine focuses on social and economic types of research. And I'm based in Seattle, and I'm also responsible for our laboratory in Olympia.
Great.
PA&W is a part of research and development, an arm of one of the major arms of the Forest Service. And there are 6 stations spread across the country that cover the entire United States and the territories, including Puerto Rico.
Mm-hmm.
How did I get here? My pathway started from Kenya. I studied forestry in University of Nairobi, did graduate school in Canada, University of Toronto, and also University of New Brunswick in Fredericton. Went back to Kenya, worked in both the private sector and public sector, came back to United States in 22 years ago, started working for DNR, Department of Natural Resources in the state of Washington, and 10 years ago, I moved to the Forest Service. In almost all those years, possibly 3/4 of that time has been in science, either conducting research as a wood scientist or managing science. I manage science mainly now.
Great. Simon, thank you. And finally, last but not least, Kevin Werner.
Thanks, Julia. Good to see everyone. So as Julia said, my name is Kevin Werner. I am the director of the Northwest Fishery Science Centers, which is one of 6 science centers in NOAA Fisheries. So it's a different part of the same agency that Michelle works for. The Northwest Fishery Science Center does a lot of different types of science, broadly in support of sustainable fisheries and protected resources. So on the sustainable fisheries side, we do the science to support the management under the Magnuson-Stevens Act. So this includes things like population dynamics, the economics. We run surveys, fish surveys, lots of data. We have an observer program there as well. On the protected resources side, this has really been sort of historically the bread and butter for the Northwest Center. A lot of work under the Endangered Species Act, Marine Mammal Protection Act, and a host of other sort of environmental acts at the federal level. So we have folks working on everything from small biology, genetics, genomics, all the way up to people that are studying whales. We have everything from like chemistry all the way over to social science, economics, and other social scientists. So a broad array of scientific disciplines represented at the Northwest Center to do the science to support the management functions of the agency and other agencies as well. So how did I get here? I actually grew up practically next door to Jill in Everett, just north of Seattle. Went to the University of Washington and for atmospheric science. Got my bachelor's and master's degree at the University of Washington, what would later become the College of the Environment. So nice to be back. Then I joined NOAA through the NOAA Commissioned Officer Corps. So NOAA has the nation's 7th services, it's called. It's patterned after the armed services, but it's dedicated to supporting the NOAA mission in terms of operating our research platforms. I did that for 5 years. Then I jumped to the Weather Service, spent the bulk of my career in the Weather Service, not actually forecasting weather. I've actually never forecast weather a day in my life, but I was forecasting stream flow, working with water resources in the Colorado River Basin mostly. So lots of time in the Southwest part of the US. Eventually got into climate, the satellite part of NOAA, a line office called NESDIS. Worked for them for a couple of years doing climate services. Then I went back to headquarters for Weather Service and helped in their sort of strategic visioning work for the future, ran their Office of Organizational Excellence. And then just 3 years ago in 2017, I came out here to work for fisheries, where I've been since. So I will stop there.
Great, thank you. Thank you to all of you guys for joining us today. So postdocs, I'm hoping you're getting a few messages here. One is you've heard a little bit about the paths of all of these panelists, and they all went through the stage that you're in now, right? So you are simply a younger version of everybody that you see on the screen. The next major message that I really want you to hear is there is an incredible wealth and diversity of positions for research scientists within the federal government that is focused here in the Pacific Northwest and obviously also beyond. So we've heard about the basic applied, we've heard about field work all the way through to pretty high-end computational stuff. We've heard about physical sciences and chemical sciences and biological sciences, and from skin in, cell genetic work all the way on up to ecosystem work, marine, freshwater, terrestrial. So just about any slice there, every single one of you on this Zoom should see yourselves in what these panelists just talked about in terms of the particular slice of lab or sets of labs and field stations that they personally direct, have their fingers on. So panelists, postdocs are in the College of the Environment at University of Washington nationally, and I would actually say probably globally, super concerned about job prospects in the pandemic, right? So even as Washington is beginning to open up a little bit, that is local Washington, there's all sorts of concern about how postdocs have had to adjust, push off their own research, be flexible in that, gaps that may be appearing on their CV as a function of that rearrangement, how they can best market themselves. And in considering applying for a federal agency job, let's just start with that basic question about what do you panelists collectively see the job market looking like? So you are a postdoc hoping to either leap into another postdoc position within the federal agencies, of which there are a lot, very, very many, and or directly into a permanent research position within any of the agencies and or the specific labs that you talk about. So who would like to take a stab at answering that? What do you see the job prospect landscape looking like in the next year?
I can start. I'm sure other people have
Thanks,
things
Sarah.
to add. So one thing to know about the federal government and employment with the federal government is that the economics of the federal government are a little bit different than the economics of the rest of the country.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're going to see coming up is, for example, state government employment is going to be tough to get, probably, because state budgets are going to be impacted. That may well be true with universities as well. The federal government operates a little bit differently sometimes because the federal government's employment is also an economic force in the country and in the world. So sometimes the federal government goes the opposite direction. It's a way to employ people, right? To create jobs and to create economic growth by hiring federal employees and spending money on federal research activities, science, everything, right? So that's something to know about and to think about, that things could go in things can look different for federal employment than they might in other sectors. Another point, many of you know this because I've been trying to get the word out, at least in CEFs and SAFs. For instance, my program is currently hiring a lot of positions all across the country because we had a huge increase in our budget last year. So we're filling those positions. I think currently right now there are something like 10 positions open in the Cooperative Research Units program, and there will be more coming online in the coming weeks and months. One last point I want to make is that employment opportunities in the federal government are incredibly diverse. So the folks on this panel are all coming from parts of the federal government where the primary mission is research. But there are scientists, PhDs, employed in a lot of different kinds of settings, including both settings where research is the primary mission, but also other kinds of places where research isn't the primary mission, but where science is a big part of how work is done. So, you know, by my count, there are at least 4 departments where I could imagine our graduates, our postdocs would be looking for jobs: Commerce, USDA, Interior, possibly HHS. Plus, there's a whole bunch of independent science agencies: NASA, NSF, the Smithsonian, Marine Mammal Commission. So the point is that in this time when the number of opportunities is small, what I want to encourage you all to do is to broaden your search and to look a little bit more broadly and learn a little bit more about what the different opportunities are out there in different agencies. And then we can sort of talk about the specifics, but the important thing to know about that is that in each one of those settings, the way you get a job will be a little bit different. So it's the academic search, faculty search. There are some pretty common sorts of things that you'll get across all of those, and that will be much less true for federal jobs. The first thing to do is become aware of them and then sort of figure out what to do from there. So,
Great.
Yep.
Sarah, thanks for that. I want to allow panelists to embroider and add to what Sarah has said, but Simon, I would like you to, we have a question particularly from one of the postdocs asking for somebody to speak about opportunities for social scientists and social science research. And Simon, if you would, I would love your thoughts on that.
For the longest time, for those of us who are in biophysical sciences, there always seemed like there was this boundary between the social scientists and the biophysical scientists. And over the last possibly 2 to 3 decades, one of the things that we have realized is, or the industry has realized, is that while they know how to conduct research, they may not necessarily know how to communicate that research or see the people's perspective. And that has meant an increase in the demand of the various disciplines of social sciences. So if I look even just a narrow focus on the Forest Service, apart from just research, when you go to the what we call the National Forest System, they are hiring social scientists, general social scientists who help them look at forest issues from a people's perspective. Mm-hmm. It may be recreation, it may be things to do with NEPA, it may be things to do with engaging with communities. All those are areas now that are becoming markets for social scientists. And when I'm saying social scientists, I'm also including the economists who actually don't seem to have a problem in terms of getting positions because their role has been more defined than, let's say, an anthropologist. If I look at our case, right now, our highest priority within the station is to increase the number of social scientists. Mm-hmm. Because the demand is very high. The demand is very high from the other biophysical scientists. The demand is high from the National Forest System. So I see the outlook for social science as having a very positive look. It's very competitive though. Mm-hmm. But then you've got to jump there and compete with the others.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. And Kevin, you may want to add into that. I know that the fishery science centers have over certainly the last decade and more than that really begun to expand and consider a much wider range of involvement of social science within the mission of the center.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Julia. I mean, so the Northwest Center alone, we have about a dozen social scientists. Most of those are economists, but we have also a couple of other types of social scientists. I should say my own background, I didn't mention my PhD is actually in political science, so I am technically a social scientist, and I found employment in NOAA. So, but I would agree with what Simon said more broadly. There's a huge demand for social scientists in the federal government, and I'd encourage you to be sort of creative and looking around. As Sarah mentioned, there's, I think, a whole host of agencies that have social science questions that they're trying to answer, some with actual social science, and some of them are doing it sort of ad hoc on their own. So there's, I think, opportunities in sort of both those categories. I'd also, just sort of jumping back to the first question, and I really appreciated Sarah's answer, and I fully agree with everything Sarah said. I would also say that in addition to what Sarah said, the federal workforce as a whole is aging. We have, I think, a disproportionate share of baby boomers still in the workforce, and there's been talk, at least over the last decade and probably longer, about those folks retiring and the need to fill behind them. I would also point out that the federal workforce itself, in terms of actual federal employees, is about the same size as it was in the 1960s. So the federal workforce is not growing. We're doing more with contracts. So especially in the sciences, we have a lot of folks working on contracts that are not federal employees, but are working for federal agencies in a contract capacity. So there's a lot of opportunity in that space, I think, across a whole bunch of agencies. And then the last comment I was going to make, and this maybe is a segue to something that I don't know if it's interesting or not, but I think it is. If you're thinking about career versus a career in academia or a career somewhere else, I think one thing to pay for most agencies that are doing research, one important point I would make is that the research needs to be pretty tied to the mission of the agency. There are some exceptions out there where that tie doesn't need to be maybe as strong as others, but I know here in NOAA, for example, and I think it's true in most agencies, we are a mission-driven agency, so being able to tie your research to the mission of the agency and the problems of the day, the management problems of the day, is something that's pretty important, sort of all the time throughout a federal career. I kind of wandered around there, Julia, but I'll stop.
No, that was great. That was perfect. And I'm postdocs. I'm reading the questions that are coming in and trying to navigate this. And panelists, just time check, we're at 12:38. This is an hour panel, so we may be able to run a few moments past 1 o'clock, but just want to keep everybody on that. Any other overall comments about the job landscape in the next year? We've heard some pretty great and positive answers from Sarah and Kevin and Simon. Michelle or Jill, would you like to leap in on that?
This is Jill. I could add a few things on USGS. So, I do agree with the comments that you've heard that the federal employment is different in that it tends to be kind of more consistent, and sometimes, we do maybe continue to grow in some cases, but I think within USGS, and particularly in our mission area, it hasn't been a mission area that's grown in the last few years. So we haven't been adding a lot of particularly new permanent positions, but we have been adding, we continue to hire some postdocs and more of these what we call term and temporary positions. Mm-hmm. And so I think especially those agencies that are tied to regulations like NOAA, they have a very specific mission that requires that science is done to support those regulatory decisions. And kind of one of the pros and cons of USGS is that we're not driven by the need to support regulations. And so we like to tout that we do kind of unbiased science, that we're not doing science in support necessarily of a regulation, but it also means that our appropriations from Congress tend to be a lot more flat than some of the other sister agencies. Mm-hmm. So while it's not gloom and doom, it's probably not as bright as some of the other agencies that are represented here.
Great. Jill, thanks. Michelle, I know you wanted to say a few words.
just very quickly, I wanted to encourage people not to constrain themselves. In addition to the departments that Sarah mentioned, Department of Energy, Department of Defense actually hires biologists and scientists, USAID, state, so don't constrain yourselves. I also just wanted to put a plug in for the cooperative institutes as another way that particularly my arm of NOAA hires people sometimes for the long term. Many of you may be familiar with it through GSAO, which is just today being replaced by the new cooperative institute, SECOS. So those are other places to look for positions.
So given that like tremendous diversity of directions within the federal government and opportunity, is there a one-stop shopping place? Where should postdocs who are really thinking about, gosh, you know, this is there's a whole world here. How do I find out? How do I figure out what jobs are available? Can folks speak to that? And Michelle, you were last up, so why don't you start now?
For actual positions, usajobs.gov is the place where all federal positions get posted, and you can set up what's called a search agent that you can constrain it by location, by agency, by job series. So federal positions are classified by, you know, a biologist, a physicist, a, you know, social scientist kind of thing. So you can constrain your search by all those things, or you can open it as wide as it gets. In my experience, the other avenues, the contracts, the cooperative institutes take a little bit more digging. You know, you need to be a little bit more plugged in to the individual places. So so sometimes some of the like posted boards, like the College of the Environment actually has quite a nice jobs board. Sometimes those can serve as good clearinghouses for those kinds of things.
Great, thanks. So USA Jobs definitely at least first place to go, but digging in a little more to particular research stations and just a link to another question that's been asked. Not cutting panelists off on the where to go to find jobs, but can you also weave into your answer something about the question of, is it okay, is it within the social construct of labs to reach out to individual people in labs? Or should I just, you know, always be going through the front door of USA Jobs and putting in an application? Is it proper to reach out to folks? Kevin, you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. I think Michelle hit the nail on the head that, yeah, the USA Jobs is where all the federal jobs are, but there's it really helps to be plugged in. So making connections, just like you would with any other job, you know, getting to know people, networking, those things help a lot to sort of stack the deck in your favor. And I see I just scared Michelle away.
Yes, you did. Hopefully we can get her back.
The other thing I would say, just in terms of tactics when you're applying for a job, my rule of thumb is as long as a job is advertised on USA Jobs, it hasn't closed yet, asking questions, reaching out to people that are involved with the job, including the hiring manager, those are all completely fair game. That's an appropriate time to have a conversation. I would say once that job closes and it goes into the selection process, then my advice is that you need to be sort of hands off and be in sort of receiver mode. So if you get called for an interview, obviously, you know, you should accept the offer for the interview if it's something you want to do. But once the job closes, I think you really, that the time for networking is sort of past for that particular opportunity.
Great.
So there's I mentioned in the answers, and I actually put it in the chat, a link to a Twitter thread that that I wrote a couple of weeks ago about how not to get, a couple tips about how not to get crossways of the USA Jobs approach to recruiting. There are a lot of ways to get stuck and get weeded out when you shouldn't get weeded out. Actually, I'm hoping that Mark Shrell and I are going to do another webinar sometime early in the summer to just sort of focus on like those kinds of issues. But I did post a few things on Twitter. So have a look at that if you're interested in applying for some of these federal jobs. USA Jobs is the place that you do have to go. And it is admittedly a bit bewildering. So if you're thinking about applying for a federal job, you see one on USA Jobs, definitely try to get in touch with people who you know who are federal employees who can give you advice about how to do that effectively and how not to get eliminated from consideration for a job for which you're actually qualified.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm seeing really broad, right approach. So definitely postdocs, we will keep you up to date, informed about that session that Sarah and Mark Sherrill, another faculty member who is in the co-op unit in the college. So you can have more sense and practice on that. And so I just, Jill, you might want to also speak to this general issue of is reaching out a good approach to researchers, to scientists in USGS, in the labs, as a way of introducing yourself, getting set up to apply for open positions.
So I think my answer is similar to what the other folks were saying, but perhaps one thing that's maybe not unique to us, but most of my principal investigators are actually affiliate faculty in various schools there at the University of Washington, many in pathobiology and some there in the College of the Environment. And so it is not uncommon for us to, when we do start looking for research assistants and postdocs, it's not uncommon for us to have relationships with folks already. And so, I think that it, behooves folks to understand, what areas of research they're interested in, and just, to look up the profiles of researchers in these various centers and, develop those relationships. That doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to get a job, but I think it's a good way to, develop your network and potentially have someplace you can reach out if there is an opportunity. Certainly not all of our positions that we advertise are filled with people that we know of in advance. And when we do advertise positions, we do get phone calls from people asking about them. And as the others said, at the point where the position is closed and HR has started its process, then that's not the time to be reaching out. So I guess what I'm saying is the more proactive you can be in looking at PI profiles and developing those relationships early on, I think is a good thing. And of course, these folks are at the university, they tend to teach or lecture, so there's a lot of opportunities to interact with them.
Yeah. Oh, goodness. Yeah, Michelle, you're not the only one. Wow, my whole train of thought went out the window there. So one question that I did that's sort of come through the Q&A thread has been around, we of course have a substantial portion of our postdoc community who are not US citizens, because being a great researcher is a worldwide thing, and doing that kind of cross-country training is fantastic. So can a non-US citizen actually work with a federal agency? And Simon, you are uniquely qualified to address that question.
Yeah, I can address it a little bit, but I wanted to add something, I think, to what Julia was saying. I know in the Forest Service, for example, we do an outreach before a job is announced. So that is sort of to just find whether there's an interest out there. And sometimes we float it for several locations to see which location will be most suitable. So when you see an outreach notice, and you're interested in that position, complete the form and send it back. And what happens is, should the job be advertised, you'll be notified by email that the job announcement is out there and you can go in and apply. Going to the citizenship question, I do know, and my other federal government colleagues will possibly correct me on that one, or support me on that one. It's very difficult to get a federal government job if you are not a citizen. And almost all of them come with that caveat: you must be a US citizen to apply for this job. However, state governments, for as long as you've got a green card, most state governments and do employ people who are not citizens, who are permanent residents. Some of them have even been, some state agencies have even been known to petition for people if they identify somebody who is conducting research in an area that they're interested in. They have been known previously to petition for those people to put them on the pathway to get a green card. But I think within the federal government, unless you're working maybe for a contractor, and I don't know that part, for the government itself, I think it's very difficult to get a job if you're not a citizen.
Great. Simon, thank you for that. Panelists, I'd love to ask you to give us some quick thoughts. And again, time check, we're at 12:52. Some quick thoughts about how postdocs who are considering working within the federal research empire, and it really is an empire. It's everywhere across the federal government, and that's the really great thing about it. I think that many people who are in academia just don't realize how much and how diverse the research enterprise is at the federal level. And of course, postdocs, you're seeing folks who play leading roles at research labs within the Pacific Northwest, but nationally, it's amazing how many. I mean, there's just tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people nationally. It's incredible. So panelists, as postdocs are thinking, okay, like, do I have to make myself look different for a federal job? We've heard somebody mention the difference between the mission agencies and not, and wanting to tune your research, your work to the mission. Are there other aspects that a aspiring postdoc would want to elevate or kind of move aside a little bit? Comparing and contrasting, and here somebody has written, for instance, number of publications. Are publications important or not? Michelle.
This is going to vary a little bit on what position you're applying for and what agency you're applying for. So for example, if you're applying to PMEL, which is very much a research organization, things like number of publications is going to matter a lot. If you're applying for a policy position where you're going to be working on regulations and things, that's going to be generally somewhat less important. But I would definitely emphasize that that's part of your qualifications as an applicant and as a scientist for these roles. So I wouldn't downgrade those kinds of things. I would think about some of the things that aren't necessarily quite as emphasized in academic applications. For example, if you're going to be hired as a federal person, that's a long-term hire. People are looking for somebody who's going to fit in. They're looking at somebody who might have leadership qualities, who can work well within an organization. So those kinds of things, your teamwork, your ability to collaborate, your ability to build those collaborations, to work across disciplines, all those kinds of things may be more emphasized than they typically in an academic setting.
Great, thank you.
This is Jill. Can I add on to that a little bit?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think one thing that we're seeing in USGS is that, you know, as Kevin mentioned, we have folks who are very close to retirement. And I think, you know, for people who started 30 years ago and perhaps were, you know, experts in a very narrow area of research, they've had very academic, or maybe what academia looked like 30 years ago within the government. They've had a very similar career. That is changing. You know, we see that the issues that we're facing are changing, and, you know, the basic science hasn't maybe not all been done, but we're looking at lots of complex interactions. And so the ability to pivot, to be able to take your skills and apply it to a new set of questions is one thing that we are looking at very critically when we make a new hire, because as Michelle said, they tend to be long-term hires. People tend to stay in the federal research workforce if that's the path they choose. And so to think that you're going to start out working on this one thing that you did during your PhD or during a postdoc, and you're going to spend the next 30 years on that is not the way we need to have employees do research anymore. We need people to be able to, you know, work on a lot of different subjects, even ones we haven't even thought about today.
Yep. And also work in teams, work with each other. The construct of the professor in a lab with folks underneath them is not the same in agency research work. There's much more team-based work and fluidity across teams. Kevin, I know you want to say something about that.
Oh, I was just laughing because that's exactly the case. Fluidity, process, lots of change. In all seriousness, I guess I would say, I think there's a ton of opportunity in government, especially now, but really there has been for a long time. It's the nation's largest employer. There's all sorts of opportunities to come in and do things differently than when you first started. And I think Jill's point is really good, that you might come in with a narrow focus and think you're going to focus on that, and maybe you will for a while, or maybe you will for a long time. But there's also, and I'd encourage you to be aware of the opportunities to do other things. Like, for example, the Washington D.C. Political policy world is always looking for scientific expertise, and always from the federal agencies. And there's a lot of opportunity. I know Jill's done this. I know I've done this. I think maybe Michelle's done a little bit of it. There's opportunity to go back to DC and play in those spaces and do things that are incredibly important for not just the country but the world. So I think it's a really great. And if you're at all considering the federal workforce, and I assume you are because you're here, you spent the last hour with us, I'd encourage you to keep considering it.
Great. Yeah, thank you. So I have to say, this happened the last panel we did. Fascinating, a lot of interaction, went by super fast. And we have just cleared an hour minus 1 minute. So I do want to respect time. Okay, postdoc, so here's what I have heard, taken away. Huge diversity of jobs and career paths out there, and a large number of jobs and types of jobs. You can get a postdoc in the agencies. You may be hireable as a temp employee or as a contractor. You may be hired into a more permanent position, but several of the panelists made that point that one of the missions of the federal government is to hire, especially in these kinds of situations. So there's a lot out there. And we just heard about where you can take that. There's a lot of places that you can take that. Also, in terms of how you're thinking about presenting yourself, there is a need to tune your presentation of yourself in your CV and a letter to the mission of the agency and to the specific research lab and to the work that's being advertised. But in some sense, that is no different than applying to an academic job, right? So you're not going to present yourself not within the box of what a university, a department would say they want. We've heard going to USA jobs is the place to go, but there are some tricks to doing that. And Sarah reminds us that she and Mark Sherrill are going to put something on that and give folks more of an ability to look at that and see what's going on. So really, I would say going this pathway is something that everybody should be exploring. And we will, at the college, attempt to try and centralize those, what's going on, how do I present myself, where do I go to find out information, who are contact people, certainly within the Pacific Northwest. And we'll put that on the Postdoc site on the college for you all, so we can use that as a resource. So panelists, thank you amazingly for spending this time with us and for giving us the benefit of your expertise and your insight. I am gonna hazard a guess that if folks on this Zoom had particular follow-up questions that they wanted to ask you, you might be willing to answer them. Okay, I'm seeing great nods. So pay attention, postdocs. These folks are here to help you out and help connect you. And so closing out the postdoc federal job hiring panel. Thanks to everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy.